Hello, class, and welcome to Lesson 3 as we study the higher elevations, especially in the northern half of Israel, high mountains, landmarks, and even some unique high places that are not completely natural, referred to as tells. Let's open in prayer. Heavenly Father, we love you. We thank you for the opportunity again to associate where you do marvelous things in an attempt to better understand why and what we are supposed to know about them. So we ask that you'll bless in this study. In the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen. Well, in our opening slide, we see some pretty spectacular views. The slide on the right is an aerial view of what it looks like when you are approaching the Sea of Galilee from the west. If you were traveling on the main route coming from the Mediterranean Sea to northern Galilee, and as you come around the Judean mountains, approaching the Sea of Galilee, you would see Tiberias. Farther in the distance, you would see Capernaum. And in the distance, on a clear day, you would even see the snow-capped mountain Hermon. The Arbel Cliffs that we see on the right would be considered the northern end of the Judean mountains, and these very steep cliffs provide a spectacular view of the Sea of Galilee. It's also a region that is known in history uh, for its cave dwellings, some natural, some man made. And if you study the life of Josephus, as he was a freedom fighter against the Romans in the first century, he was a leader of the resistance of Jews, and they were held up in the caves of the Arbel Cliffs. And one of his notable stories in his book of Antiquities talks about how the Romans would scale down the cliffs, use long staffs, hooks to grab onto resistance fighters and pull them out of the cliffs, out of the caves, to their death as one of the last resistance. And then Josephus become a noted historian after that, and much of what we know about first century church is credited to him. That's what we're going to attempt to do in this lesson, is associate some of the significant historical events of Israel to high places. And again, we're going to focus on the region of Galilee in the northern half of Israel. On the top left, we see the picture of a model that very accurately describes Megiddo. It's referred to as Tel Megiddo, a man-made mountain. And on the bottom, we see a wonderful view of naturally occurring waterfalls in the Golan Heights. When we consider Upper Galilee, we want to recognize the main area is the Sea of Galilee. It's also known as Kinnereth, or the Sea or Lake of Tiberias. Some argue that the Sea of Galilee is technically not a sea, as some definitions of a sea refer to it as being salt water contiguous to the oceans. And if you would follow that definition, no, the Sea of Galilee would be more accurately called a lake, a technicality, of course. The region of Galilee was known as a very affordable place to live for people who were not of any associated class or um, politically connected. Um, if you lived in the area of Jerusalem, Jerusalem has always been a politically charged city. During the time of Jesus, you would need to be part of a religious or a political sect, a Sadducee, a Pharisee, maybe one of the scribes, maybe you would be a Herodian. You would have to be part of some organized group in order to gain an education, in order to live in a protected area or zone, in order to have a job, in order to be cared for, to have support systems. You had to be part of a class. And if you didn't fit in any of those classes or were considered less desirable, it would make sense to move out of that region of southern Judea and travel to northern area of Israel, specifically Galilee. And there you would find a place where if you had roots that had been there for a period of time, you may actually have a cave dwelling in your family. If not, it's still a region that has moderate temperatures year around. It's a fertile area where it's easy to grow crops. But most specifically, the Sea of Galilee was an abundant source of fish. The reason for that is the northern portion of the Sea of Galilee is fed by warm water springs, and that's due to geothermal activity, as this is a part of a rift uh, that has volcanic activity beneath. And it's evident from all of the region of Upper Galilee with black basaltic rock that was, for a large part, the building material that was used for centuries. These warm water springs provide an abundant habitat for fish. So you could easily fish to feed your family, do some form of agriculture, and live in an area where the standard of living was very low. This is the economic and social environment that Jesus chose to perform most of his 3 1/3 year ministry. And being associated with Nazareth, um, the phrase, could anything good come out of Nazareth, was more of a confirmation that this was a impoverished, low quality area as far as political views go. And Jesus found that that was the most appropriate place for his ministry. He spent most of his time in Capernaum, Bethsaida, Chorazin, and then later he even drew attention to these cities as being very critical of them. They saw enough miracles, they had experienced enough special um, evidence of Jesus' supernatural messiahship that they should have responded more vividly, and they didn't. And we even know that Jesus cursed these 3 cities because other cities, should they have had that kind of opportunity, would have been expected to have great revivals. Now, we talked about fishing in the area. Um, Below is a picture of a common dish even today. It's called the St. Peter's fish. Now, I'm certain that that is a phrase that's very marketing oriented, but being the region where Peter was one of the fishermen, the most noted fisherman of the disciples, the fish that you see below um, is probably a form of tilapia. Tilapia was introduced to the Sea of Galilee in recent centuries. We don't know exactly when, but it was introduced from Africa. The tilapia is an African fish and it desires warm waters. And this would be the most northern region you would find tilapia growing. And that's due to those warm water springs feeding into the lake. The boat you see at the bottom is the replica of an ancient boat that was discovered in recent decades. It's called the Jesus boat, not that it has any connection with Jesus, but effective and accurate carbon dating has placed the boat's date of existence back to the time of Christ. I might also mention that during archaeological studies, it's important to make a distinction in radioactive dating. Carbon dating has half-lives of thousands of years and is considered to be verifiable, and Bible scholars embrace the results of carbon dating with little variation. However, there are other radioactive isotopes that claim to have half-lives of, or it's said that they have half-lives of millions of years, and of course that's a time span that could not be tested, and Bible scholars do contest those results. But when we talk about carbon dating, for example, with this boat, we're very confident that this is the style of boat that was in existence during the time of the fishermen uh, in Jesus's period. So it's a marvelous study in archaeology how the boat was recovered. It had been sunken in the mud, and as it was discovered accidentally, experts come in, and the spongy wood material was very fragile even when being exposed to air. So they quickly dug underneath the boat, injected underneath the boat packing foam that once it solidified becomes rigid, and created a cradle, or you might say a boat underneath a boat. And as they built a significant watertight um, body underneath the boat, then they opened up a channel to the lake, and the boat within a cradled boat floated on the water without being handled, and they floated it into a special museum now that sits at the Sea of Galilee, and it is in a protected environment where it has now been coated, treated. This is not the original. This is a replica of the original. The original has much of the wood that's missing, but certainly a intriguing find. And we're going to talk more about that type of archaeology in this lesson. But let's continue with the high places. In the region that is referred to as Transjordan, during the time of Christ, it was referred to as Golanitis. Now we refer to it more as Golan, and even more specifically, the Golan Heights. It's an area that has been uh, very popular in world events during my lifetime, as it's been an area of much warfare, but it has always been an area of conflict. If you were to visit today, on the upper left-hand side, you see a bunker with a blackened out UN soldier. Um, I've been there a few times and met and spoke with the soldiers, and they are in a peacekeeping role, trying to stay between the Syrian troops and the Israeli troops. And there are fenced in compounds and borders, as you can see on the bottom. This conflict between Syria and Israel has existed for generations, and this generation is not any different. Today, this video is made in 2018. Today, we are still learning about the civil war that's in Syria and the unrest there, which causes continued tension on the Israeli border. But why? Why is this region always so contentious? Well, if you consider the location on the map, it is the northern border along the most popular traveled road that goes north out of Israel. And when we consider, as we've studied before, the highly traveled route for all generations since the time of Abraham, at least, when we consider the heavily traveled route that goes from Egypt up into Mesopotamia, that route travels through Damascus, which on this graph or map would be to the top right hand corner, through Damascus and crosses over the Jordan River either around the area just north of the Sea of Galilee or at the Sea of Galilee. And in traveling through that area, if there was going to be an army that would invade from the north, then they would come through this region, and this would be the territory that you would try to protect first from an invading army. Now, again, let's remember during the period of biblical history, we know that Egypt has always been the large military force to the south, but the countries to the north have been ever changing. I like to refer to them, if you will, as the big gorilla at the north. When we look at the time of Joshua and the period of Judges, especially, Syria would have been the attacking force from the north, and we know that the Syrians were constantly giving the northern 10 tribes problems. Then the Assyrians grew to become an international power. The Assyrians to the north were then conquered by the Babylonians. The Babylonians were then conquered by the Medo-Persians. The Medo-Persians eventually yielded to the Greeks, and then the Greeks ultimately to the Roman Empire. Now, all of the countries I've just named, aside from Egypt to the south, all of those countries were located north of Israel. So, as all of the uh, geopolitical, military um, conquests were taking place, the avenging foes were always from the north. So this region has been very well documented as being an area of conflict. That goes into a more popular or common history in the 20th, 21st century. The Golan Heights, which is now a beautiful, highly productive agricultural site because of its past volcanic activity, it provides the wonderful area of a growth for crops similar to Kentucky, as it has a limestone base, a shallow, rich soil, and the rich soil would be due to the volcanic activity. When volcanic ash settles in a region, it is full of rich minerals, and if it's not deep, if it's not thick, then it prohibits the growth of trees because trees can't get deep roots into the ground. So it's easy to cultivate, it's easy to keep the land clear and productive. And that's what you see on the Golan Heights. But um, in the time period since World War II, the area had been more of a conflict in the Arab-Israeli war. So as the region was under control for 700 years by the Ottoman Turks, at the result of World War I, England had conquered the region, but not for long. The then Syrian army had control of the Golan Heights from the period of 46 to 67, and they used it as a military stronghold to terrorize the Israeli population. They would launch for years low tech, inexpensive mortars, bombs onto the people living in the communal settings known as kibbutz. That's a word you want to remember. Kibbutz, kibbutz. And the people were trying to work in the fields and fishing in the areas below were constantly terrorized by these random falling bombs. But what happened that really brought about a military reaction was the Syrians and the Jordanians threatened to start cutting off natural drainage water supplies feeding into the Jordan River. And it's clearly understood if the nation doesn't have a safe, reliable water supply, a nation can't exist. So that prompted what became known in June 1967 as the Six-Day War. And in that Six-Day War, the Israeli forces forced out the Jordanian, Syrian, Lebanon, Egyptian, and a combination of Saudi and uh, Iraqi forces that were making their presence known in Israel, specifically the Jordanians in the West Bank region. And in that Six-Day War, what the Zionists in Israel claim is to be something supernatural that only God could do, they forced those Arab forces out of Israel. And not only did they push the Jordanian army back to the other side of the Jordan River, where they is the boundary today, but they continued in the Golan Heights region in order to take all the high country up to the Syrian border, and that protected their water supply and it stopped the shelling of the people down below. So, all the way back to the time of Abraham, Moses, we know that when the nation of Israel, the 12 tribes, Moses and Joshua, as they were crossing the Jordan and entering into the promised land, two and a half of the tribes wanted to stay over on the Transjordan side. That would have been the region of Golan. And we know that Moses even recognized the city of Golan in this region as a sanctuary city of the Levitical tribe. So the two and a half tribes that were allowed to return after the conquest of the Promised Land, the two and a half tribes that were allowed to return and live in this fertile, rich land was authorized by the leaders. And during the attacks of the Syrian, Assyrian, and as we'd mentioned before, the other nations, those attacks initiated on the Transjordan side where the tribes were more exposed. So the Golan Heights, much history due to its location. It has been associated with warfare. But not just warfare. During the time of Christ, there wasn't military warfare because the Roman Empire had conquered all adversaries, and there really wasn't an adversary other than internal conflicts. So during the time of Christ, the region known as Gaulonitis at that time was under the rule of Herod's son Philip the Tetrarch. Now, if you recall, back in the time of John the Baptist was critical of the Herodians, and specifically, he was critical of Herod II and his wife Herodias. Um, they had a illegitimate marriage according to um, Old Testament Levitical law, and Herod II had married his relative Herodias, who was previously married to his brother Herod, and they had a daughter. Her name was Salome. Salome was the young lady who danced for Herod and then in return asked for the head of John the Baptist. Well, Salome married Philip the Tetrarch. So we see all of the tension and all of the political turmoil that was going on during the Herodian leadership period. Herod the Great was known as a master builder, as we're going to discuss in this lesson. He was also known as a master butcher. And the Herodians, we know, were very antagonistic um, against the Jewish people, while the Herodians claimed to be Jews, and he was king of the Jews. Uh, they were only Jewish by religion that was forced upon them generations earlier. They were actually descendants from the Edomians or Edomites, the long-standing adversaries of the descendants of Jacob, Israel. So Herod the Great was a master builder. For example, he's credited with building Caesarea Maritime on the Mediterranean Sea, um, and dedicated it in the name of Caesarea to Caesar. He's credited for Caesarea Philippi, its initial grand construction. He's credited with building the temple that replaced Ezra's temple around 20 BC, and that would have been the temple and the Temple Mount that Jesus walked in. Herod the Great, as he died, passed down his leadership to his sons. And when Herod the Great was in the midst of his great building period, he selected an area that we will refer to in this study as Caesarea Philippi, but it really became most popular during the time of Herod the Great as he built a worship center in the region of Golan. It was an area that had for centuries before Herod been known as a, a supernatural region that was associated with cult worship. And we know that it goes back as far as Alexander the Great, even. And if we were to look at a of what that cultic worship center looked like, if you see on the left, there is a cave referred to as a grotto, Grotto, with a marble temple in front of it. And this is what Herod the Great built in dedication to Pan. And Pan um, was the most popular war related god at the time, and he named the region Panias. Now you'll see many other worship centers, temples there dedicated to many other gods. And you can imagine by this artist's rendition, this would have been a very popular place, a very cultic, dark place for Christians or Jews, as monotheistic Christians or Jews would claim there's only one God. Here you would have a multitude of gods, and you would have the sale of religious relics and quite a commerce here. So if we go back and look at the roots of Caesarea Philippi, we know that when Alexander the Great, in the beginning of the Greek Empire, when he broadcasted not only his um, military strength all over the known world, Alexander the Great was so popular when he would conquer regions. For example, Egypt named him as a pharaoh, and they considered him to have done more accomplishments in a short period of time than any of the pharaohs, and that's quite a statement. They even named the city, renamed the city of great learning, Alexandria, because of him. And what Alexander did under the tutelage of Socrates as he was growing up, Alexander was known for promoting Hellenism. And Hellenism was a form of belief system that recognized the body, mind, and spirit. And everywhere that Alexander went, he promoted the development of libraries for knowledge, gymnasiums for physical health, and a very prolific spiritual life with a multitude of gods. So, um, Panias recognized for Pan, the Greek god that was known as the goat footed god, half man, half goat from desolate places. He would play his flat pan flute, and it would cause much panic, and that's where the word panic comes from, by the way, with their enemies. And it was a supernatural um, farce, if you will, in order to motivate your army and have confidence. So, from the time of Alexander the Great and the Greek Empire, then to the time of Herod the Great, who used this region to develop more of his influence through architecture, commerce, and controlling the people, the thoughts of the people, he chose to develop Caesarea Philippi. Now, Philip the Tetrarch came in the next generation, and this is the time of Jesus, and he further expanded uh, that area of Peneus, and he renamed it Caesarea Philippi, again acknowledging Caesar for giving him the authority to rule over a region, and of course naming it after himself. Now, if you look at um, the studies of Josephus, Josephus tells us many things about this false form of worship, and he describes how the cave or the grotto was associated with the pit of hell. And the tradition was that if water levels had gone down in the cave, that meant Pan was unhappy and he was going to unleash the forces of hell. So the followers of Pan would perform child sacrifices. And as children were thrown into the cave, if there was signs of blood that would be seeping out of the waters below the cave, then they would know that Pan was not yet satisfied. But if they no longer saw the blood mingled in the water, then the cursed period was over. Of course, a simple deduction there. As the water table rose and there was more water flowing, the blood would be diluted and you wouldn't notice it in the water as well. Um, that is part of the association of supernatural activity in this cultic region. Why did this supernatural cultic faith begin in this region? Well, if you were to look at the landscape to the north of Caesarea Philippi, you have the highlands of Lebanon and Syria. And in this mountainous region, especially in the limestone laden mountainous region, you would have higher elevations where much of the rainfall coming from the Mediterranean Sea, as it settled into the mountain ranges, it would seep into the limestone aquifers, subterranean waters develop, and we would see that eventually these subterranean waters would surface, especially in an area where there would be a deep crevasse in the landscape, and that would be the Jordan Rift Valley. And as the water seeped from underneath the base of Mount Hermon, where three springs gush with water, then we would see what today in geography, we would see a very natural water flow. But without that study of those sciences, it appeared to be supernatural rivers coming out of the base of a mountain, which was not only a spring for water, but a spring for cultic um, exaggerations. So we see why this particular reason was chosen as a cultic um, religious site. Herod playing all sides of the angle. Herod not only built this worship center for multiple gods in northern region of Israel, but he also rebuilt the temple for the Jews and made it a luxurious temple and developed the Temple Mount that we'll study in another lesson. And again, it was to attract people and to show his grand architecture. And it really was all about Herod and Herod's sons and how they had control of the people. And that is Caesarea Philippi. Now, talking just a little bit more about the sources of the Jordan River, the springs would pool together at the base of Mount Hermon. And if you look at a map, um, that region is known as Hula. And because of the multiple sources pooling together, um, the area was always a wetland marsh. And in later generations, with the understanding of malaria, it was deemed necessary to reroute and collect these water flows and drain the Hula Marsh area. And it became a fertile farming ground for a period of time until it was overfarmed and farmed out. And if you drive through that area today, it is more of just a protected land. And the Jordan River begins at the base of Mount Hermon with the three major springs, and the Jordan River then travels into the northern end of the Sea of Galilee, and then the Jordan River, which is unique for a river to be credited as the source into a sea or a lake and back out of the sea or a lake. Then it traverses south out of the southern part of the Sea of Galilee, and it migrates through the land of Israel to the Dead Sea. So before we leave our study on Caesarea Philippi, I do want to remind you, um, it is located at the base of Mount Hermon because of the seemingly supernatural flow of water. And for people living in Palestine, the Jordan River was the source of life in that region. So the source of waters to that source of agricultural and settlements, that would have been important to the people. And in an agrarian society, when you're counting on God to make your crops flourish, then obviously it would be easy for those things to be exaggerated. Now, as we study more about Golan and the area known as Caesarea Philippi, we know that Philip was very influential, and his coins that were coined at that time shows Caesarea Philippi in this specific coin. It shows a domed temple with a woman standing inside of it. There are other coins that recognize Philip by name, and I'm going to encourage you to stop, pause the video at this time, and go back and look at the slides and make sure you're comfortable with all the information, as I haven't covered everything that was in the slides, before we go to this next part. In the next slide, we're going to refer back to the time of Christ and ask the question, why in Mark chapter 8 and Luke chapter 9, and I encourage you to read both of those cited passages, why did Jesus take his disciples from the area of Capernaum, travel north unto, in the King James Version, it's called the shores of Caesarea Philippi, and that's just an Old English term for boundaries. Why did Jesus take his disciples to the region of Caesarea Philippi, excuse me, when that region would be considered such a dark and occultic place? When we read these passages, we're reminded that he stopped as they reached that area, and he asked his disciples the question, who do people say that I am? And what an appropriate location. And what we have here is Jesus with an illustration contrasting light and dark, spiritual truth and spiritual lies. He asked the question because as this region was known as a place where anybody could come and worship any god that they wanted, and there was a plethora of gods to choose from, and that was a region where religious relics, idols, probably fortune tellers, prostitute-related worship, all of these things would have been productive at Caesarea Philippi, with everybody having the conversation in that region, which god or gods do you worship? That would have been the perfect location for Jesus to stop and say, who do people say that I am? And the disciples said various answers, including prophets from before. And then Jesus more specifically said, but who do you say that I am? And of course, Peter steps up and he says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And he's very specific. One God, one living God. You are the promised Messiah. And he calls Peter by his parents' given name, Simon Barjonas. And he said, blessed are you because you didn't learn this from human beings. You learned this from my Heavenly Father. Now, he's citing there what God has always used, even in Galatians and Hebrews, it refers back to the faith of Abraham. As God spoke to Abraham and Abraham responded with obedience, that is what was counted toward righteousness for Abraham. Here, Jesus is going back to the exact same approach. It's because God has pricked your heart and you responded, not because some man come up with a convincing argument. And he says, upon this rock, this faith-built foundation, I will build my church. Now, obviously, several denominations have taken this inappropriately, and Peter has been cited as somebody that he wasn't. Jesus was not focusing on Peter here. Jesus was focusing on, and this is why, it's so important to understand why they were at this location. Jesus was making a contrast between a false man-centered faith system as compared to the Heavenly Father's Holy Spirit faith-based system. One was real, the living God. The other was fake. And he says, upon this rock, upon this foundation of faith-based believing, I will build my church. And when we recognize where they were, and when I've taught this lesson in Israel before, I even stop along the pathway that is commonly traveled into Caesarea at this time. And wouldn't it have been appropriate as you come upon the rise and you can see the worship centers off in the distance for the first time, wouldn't it have been appropriate if upon that rise, that's where Jesus pulled off of the path and had this teaching lesson? And I think that that holds much credibility. So when we consider geography and understand what was going on in specific areas, we can better translate this into the understanding of pure doctrine, because we want our theology to be well founded and as accurate as we can. If you go to Caesarea Philippi today, this is what the ruins would look like. As you can see, the cave or the grotto of Pan is still evident today. The water levels are much lower today due to the use of water by settlements and just agricultural purposes. Can you imagine if the road today is typically like this, how much it would have been at the time of Jesus before the restraint and use of water up in the highlands before it entered into the underground water systems. When you go to Caesarea Philippi, you hear the rolling waters as they are gushing out from underneath the cave area, as you see here, but then the water very quickly settles down into a very slow and quiet moving Jordan River, and it's a very peaceful place. In fact, there's a wonderful picnic area just beneath downstream of where this upper picture is taken, and it goes from the busyness and the sound of the waters to a very tranquil place. On the top left, we see a image of the false god Pan holding his flute. On the bottom right, you see niches, Niche, niches carved into the face of the mountain where the worship centers would have been. And from the coins that we see from the era, we know that they placed their idols in those niches. So I encourage you to continue to study about Caesarea Philippi and consider that one of your places to visit, as it is an exciting place to experience um, the sensation of what the Bible describes. Who do men say that I am? Now, in other assignments associated with this lesson, you're going to be finding locations on the map of other natural occurring high places, mountains of interest. Um, One of your assignments, you will point out Mount Nebo, and of course, that's where Moses stopped, as God did not allow him to go into the promised land, at least not at that time. And Mount Hermon, that is at the northern region, Syria, northern region of Israel, and credited as the source of springs forming the Jordan River. Mount Carmel over on the near the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. Of course, that's where Elijah had the conflict with the prophets of Baal. When you are on top of Mount Carmel, it's a wonderful view. Mount Tabor, that is the location where the judge Deborah had the conflict with Barak, and it involved the God bringing rain at the right time and the sinking of the chariots into the mud so that God's people would have victory. Uh, the mountains Gerizim and Ebal, those are the two mountains that Joshua led the nation of Israel to after the victory of Jericho and after the embarrassment and then subsequent victory of Ai. He led the people to Gerizim and Ebal, which is in the region of Shechem, and there he had half of the tribes located at the base of Mount Ebal and half of the tribes at the base of Mount Gerizim. And as Joshua read the writings of Moses that had been given by God before, as the blessings were rehearsed, they would praise and shout from Mount Gerizim. And as the cursings were rehearsed, there would be wailing and moaning from Mount Ebal. And certainly it was an identification of that very special place, which later become known as the resting grounds of the patriarchs, um, a reminder that God's word was validated, that it was real, and that the cursings and the blessings were still in effect. Mount Gilead was known for, and it's in the Transjordan area, it was known for the balm, a medicinal balm in Gilead. That region of Gilead was also an area that had felt indebted to King Saul. One of his earliest military campaigns was to come and rescue the people of Gilead that were being brutalized by warlords, and they become lifetime friends of Saul. And across the Jordan River, in the area of Mount Gilboa. Gilboa is where Saul had his last military conflict, and then nearby Bet Shean, which is a tell, man-made tell. Bet Shean is the location where Saul and his sons were hung on the wall, and the friends of Saul from Gilead, they came at night, traveled all night across the Jordan River, come and rescued the bodies and brought them back to Jabesh Gilead in order to give Saul and his sons a respectful um, funeral ceremony. Mount Lebanon, which would be located to the northwest of Israel, would have been the site of the cedars of Lebanon. used to rebuild the temple. And then, of course, a mountain that may not be known as a high mountain, but a very popular mountain, would be Mount Olivet, which is located just east of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And of course, that's the site where Jesus ascended into heaven. So I'm going to ask you to be very familiar with all those locations in the map as part of this class. Again, when we consider these high areas, Mount Carmel is a beautiful mountain. From the top of Mount Carmel, which we feel certain we could locate within a couple hundred feet, where Elijah stood with his conflict with the prophets of Baal, bringing down fire from heaven. From that mountain, you can see the Mediterranean Sea. In fact, you can see it closely enough that you could identify or recognize ships on the ocean, on the sea. And at the same time, you could look eastward and you could see the Jordanian mountains, which of course is on the other side of the Jordan River, meaning you could see across the entire nation, east to west. And then, speaking of views, of course, Mount Nebo. And the picture on the bottom shows the likely view that Moses would have had. As you look down into the green, lush area, would be the location of the Jordan River. Beyond that green, lush area, while you can't see it well in this picture, on a clear day, you could see the city of Jericho. And this is what Moses would have seen when he saw the millions of people during the crossing of the Jordan River. If the Lord allowed him to watch that crossing, that's a view that he would have had. So again, we want to point out these some of these mountains as significant areas that we would want you to be comfortable with on a map. And when you understand and connect the Bible passage with the geographic location, it has a greater meaning to you. But there are other high places to consider too. This is known as Tel Megiddo. Megiddo is located at a strategic location in the Jezreel Valley that is associated with a very narrow pass where anytime you're traveling north to south through Israel, you must go through this pass. If you were a caravan or an army, it's the only reasonable place due to the Mediterranean Sea and the mountains surrounding that area. The Pass of Megiddo, which is also associated with Armageddon, this location has been a key strategic military location for all generations prior to the time of Abraham. And this area has a saying with it: whoever has control of Megiddo has control over the travel and commerce of Palestine or the Promised Land. And indeed, that is a credible argument. If you were to see Tel Megiddo today, you can see the excavations that have taken place. It is one of the most marvelous archaeological digs in history. Part in that it's always been a place of turmoil, and there's been need for much military activity. Part in that the climate is very conducive to artifacts being maintained. And as these excavations take place, you'll hear people talk in archaeology in Israel often if you dig down 15 feet. Well, that's because there has been 15 feet of debris and sand has accumulated over the last 2,000 years. If you go down deeper than 15 feet in most regions of Israel, you will go to even older civilizations. If you look at the model of Megiddo to the bottom right, look at the ribs, the rims. You can see there's multiple layers. That's because Megiddo was probably maybe 120 feet high as a natural occurring hill or a rise. It was a desirable place because in that area, it was a rise by itself, and it would have made a natural place for fortification. But as civilizations would rise and fall there, you would see the need for more building materials. Now, part of the building materials would have been um, found locally, and part of them had to be shipped in from farther away. For example, look at the cut limestone on the bottom left. This cut limestone is what the walls, and specifically this gate system on the left, would have been made from. And this gate system is called an 8-chamber gate system. And as you can see, this would have been a marvelous location during peacetime for commerce, for the leaders of the city to do business. We know that the leaders of a city would locate at the gate of the city. And if it was a well fortified city, there would only be one gate many times, as is the case with Megiddo. But during the time of impending danger, and being up on a high area and being able to see an army coming from far away, then you would quickly move the commerce in, sound the alarm, and all of your citizenry that would be living in the immediate area would rush into the protected walls. Then you would put up gates, close the gates, and you would have these chambers converted into a military compound. You could have 100,000 soldiers in an army trying to invade a fortified city. But if there's only one gate and you can't breach the walls, and you can see from this model how that could be possible, if you couldn't breach the walls and you had to come through the gate, then if the gate was only 3 people or 2 horses wide, that's all you would have to defend. Can you imagine going up this passageway to get into the city? And when you get to the gate system, you can only have 3 or 4 people abreast charging the city, trying to knock the gate down. And if you did knock the gate down, as you're passing through this 6-chamber area, they have long spears within the chambers, and they are poking at you as you're trying to come through. What's not seen here is the wooden structure that would have been above, as they are launching arrows at you and pouring hot oil or molten metal on top of you. It would be a very difficult place in ancient warfare to attack. That's why Megiddo was considered to be a strategic military stronghold. All of the traffic going north-south had to go through this region in a narrow pass with an easily defendable city. Now, as we talk about this location, it's prompting us to consider, what is a tell? A tell is an artificial hill that's been created by many generations of people that have been living there and rebuilding on the same spot. Over time, that region would rise in elevation because of the building material that would commonly be brought in. The single biggest contributor of the growing mass would be mud bricks. Over time, they disintegrate, or renovations, they couldn't be relocated, or during battle, they would be destroyed. So, as these mud bricks were no longer usable, they would be spread out and additional building material would come in. Lots of times, people would go down to maybe a solid rock foundation, tear down the brick that's on the top, and go down to the solid foundation and build up from there. And as this would happen over time, the hilly area would continue by layer, get higher and higher and higher. And if you excavate these regions, you would see the remains of ancient buildings, at least their foundations. You would see religious shrines, homes, and as you collect information and date the information, then you could determine the architecture, the purpose, and even the dates of this occupation. I mentioned before that the the science of archaeology depends upon radioactive dating, and carbon dating, which dates back accurately for thousands of years, provides this incredible link. You could look at building materials, you could look at tools that were found within a strata, a layer of the remains. You could find any organic material, meaning something that was alive at one time, like a tree, and then it was used in fiber of pottery or used in papyrus. You could carbon date that and determine the age of that material when it was once alive. It had active carbon molecules in it. Measure the half life of the carbon, you can now date it. So you can have a collection within a strata of building materials, tools, pottery, artwork, um, writings, inscriptions in clay, clay tablets, and radioactive dating of ash or other types of organic material. And now you have built a storyline of the age and the culture of the people living at that time. So, a tell, an old saying is, a tell is a place that has a story to tell, and maybe that will help you remember. In Tel Megiddo, you see there were many buildings within the enclosed walls, stables for horses, um, storehouses for years worth of grain for the animals and the people. But also notice this very large pit. And there's a staircase that goes into the pit. Why would you have a pit dug into the middle of a man made mountain? Well, you may have already figured it out. In order to have a fortified area, you also have to have water. The other thing that makes Megiddo very special is there's a natural occurring spring that was not far from the natural occurring hill of low elevation. And in earlier settlements, they would have had a protective wall to where the residents of the tell or the Megiddo would have had some form of protection in getting to their spring for fresh water. But somewhere along the way, uh, somebody had the idea, what if we built a shaft down through the middle of the tell and we dig a tunnel underneath the naturally occurring spring and bring the water, instead of surfacing near the base of the tell, make it accessible only from within the tell. And you can see how this would have been accomplished. If you go to the dig at Tel Megiddo today, you can go down a modern stairway and you can walk along the tunnel around the spring, and they now have it opened up so that you can go out the other end of the spring and eventually get back on your tour bus. But how marvelous it would be to have an invading army with no accessible water supply, but yet you inside your fortified city with uh, years worth of grain already stored up and an endless supply of fresh water. Again, um, what a wonderful location to have a fortification. Napoleon even mentioned that up until the time of aircraft today, Megiddo was known as one of the most marvelous strategic locations of military science and warfare. Napoleon said that Megiddo was one of the most marvelous and worthy of studying military locations in the world. And up until the time of World War I and the advent of aircraft in warfare, Megiddo was considered to be a formidable location and one of the most talked about locations in the world in military science. So, Megiddo has long had a place in military history, and we also know that according to apocalyptic writing, that Armageddon, also has a place in the final conflict and battle as um, the enemies of Jesus in his return will marshal their forces at Armageddon in their approach to Jerusalem for the final conflict. And of course, Jesus will not wait, and he will ascend upon that area with the collected forces of the enemy, and the blood will flow to the horse's bridle. But that's a talk for another time. Now let's go back to the understanding of ancient civilization and the criteria for such civilizations. What are the three criteria that archaeologists discuss for an ancient site? Well, one, we've talked about it. There must be an easy way to protect it. And armies don't like fighting uphill. The person on the top fighting down has the advantage, and especially if you add a wall in the incline, it gives you a decisive advantage. So um, the area must be easy to defend if you're going to live there for a long time. There must be access to food nearby, and that would be most appropriate at Megiddo because you're surrounded by the Jezreel Valley, one of the most productive valleys, fertile valleys in the world. And as they would raise that grain and collect it and store it for impending invasions, it was a marvelous way to protect yourself and be ready for the long haul. And then, lastly, as shown in this um, depiction, protection of water and access to water during a siege that could last for months, maybe even years. If you have these three components, easy to defend, food nearby, accessible water, you now have the makings of a site that will be fought over for many centuries, and over the course of those centuries, you will then have a increase of building materials. You will have layers of culture and civilization that will build upon each other, and layer pancaked over layer over layer over layer is the making of a tale. So as we close this study, we'll look at one more aerial view of Megiddo and the coveted water system, and we see the shaft that you can still descend. They could have had pulley systems with buckets bringing water up, or could have just carried the water back up in buckets. The location of the tunnel, and of course now the excavated spring that you can now walk back out and get back on your tour bus. So I hope you have learned much about archaeology, about specific high places in Israel, especially the northern half of Israel, and why things happened where they did, the technology of warfares and civilization that determined strategic sites for settling. And with these understandings, as we carry this information on through the rest of this study, you'll be able to build upon the understanding of these systems. So I appreciate you very much for listening, and until next time, may God richly bless.